The clink of her fork against the porcelain plate was the only sound Leah allowed herself to make. She was seated across from Isabella Moretti in a restaurant far too expensive for a museum archivist's salary. A place of hushed tones and heavy silver. The light from the tall windows caught the deep red of the wine in Isabella's glass. Leah had chosen water. She always chose water when she was with her former mother-in-law. Kept her senses sharp. Isabella, a woman whose 70 years were etched in elegant lines around her eyes and mouth, smiled warmly. The smile did not quite reach the sorrow that lived permanently in her gaze. A sorrow Leah understood better than anyone. They shared a grief that had no name. Pleasant lunch. That is what she had told herself this was. A rare, pleasant lunch with the only piece of her former life she had refused to surrender. She had been free for 2 years. 2 years of quiet apartments, of dust motes dancing in the silent air of the archives, of a life rebuilt piece by piece from the wreckage. She had curated her existence as carefully as she curated the rare textiles in her museum's collection. She had her work. She had her small circle of friends who knew nothing of her past. She had these carefully rationed lunches with Isabella. It was enough. It had to be. However, the fragile piece of her curated world shattered when the restaurant doors opened. A shift in the atmosphere, a subtle drop in temperature, made her look up, and there he was, Dante, her ex-husband. He stood framed in the doorway, a figure carved from shadow and expensive wool. His suit was a dark charcoal, tailored so perfectly it seemed a part of him. He was not looking at her. His attention was on the maitre d', his posture radiating an impatient stillness that was more menacing than any overt threat. Beside him, a young woman with bright blonde hair and a dress the color of champagne clung to his arm. The girl was a stranger, but her type was achingly familiar. Young, dazzled, entirely unaware of the predator whose leash she held. Leah's breath caught. She felt Isabella tense beside her. A small, sharp intake of air. Dante's gaze finally swept the room. A lazy, proprietary scan that was not for seeing but for owning. His eyes, the color of dark coffee, passed over their table, then snapped back. They locked onto his mother first. A flicker of something unreadable, surprise perhaps, crossed his features. Then his eyes found Leah. The air between them became a physical thing, thick and cold and heavy. The noise of the restaurant faded to a dull roar in her ears. He did not move. He did not speak. He just looked at her. And in that look, 2 years of carefully constructed peace crumbled into dust. She was not just an archivist having lunch. She was the ex-wife of Dante Moretti, the head of the Moretti family, and he was frozen in the doorway of a public restaurant, staring at her as if he had seen a ghost sitting beside his own mother. The young woman on Dante's arm, Tiffany, shifted her weight, her smile faltering as she followed his gaze. Her expression tightened with a petty, immediate jealousy that was almost comical. Leah felt a bitter taste rise in her throat. She had been that girl once, though she had never been so naive. She had known, on some level, what he was from the beginning. She had simply believed love could build a wall high enough to keep the darkness out. She had been wrong. Dante's face was a mask of cold control, but Leah had spent 8 years learning to read the subtle tells. The slight tension in his jaw. The way his thumb brushed almost imperceptibly against his index finger. He was processing, calculating. The public setting was a cage, restraining the violence that was his native tongue. He gave a curt nod to the maitre d', dismissing him, and started walking toward their table. Not with the woman, but alone. Each step was deliberate, eating up the space between them. The restaurant held its breath. Isabella placed a trembling hand on Leah's arm. Her knuckles were white. "Leah," she whispered, the name a plea. Leah covered the older woman's hand with her own, her touch steady and firm. She would not let him see them crumble. She had learned long ago that with men like Dante, composure was armor. She met his eyes as he stopped beside their table, his shadow falling over them. He smelled the same, sandalwood and something else, something cold and metallic like the city in winter. "Mother," he said. his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Leah's bones. He inclined his head toward her, a gesture of respect that felt like a performance. What a surprise! His gaze shifted to Leah, and the pretense of civility vanished. His eyes were flat, hard. Leah. He said her name like it was a piece of grit on his tongue. It was not the way he used to say it, in the dark, whispered like a prayer. This was a different man. Or perhaps this was the man he had always been, and she had only seen what she wanted to see. She simply nodded, a small, tight movement of her chin. Dante. Isabella drew herself up, the matriarch's steel returning to her spine. We are having lunch, Dante. As we do every month. Her tone was a rebuke. She was reminding him of a loyalty that predated and superseded the girl waiting for him by the door. This is a surprise, he repeated. But his eyes were still on Leah, cataloging her. The simple black dress she wore. The way her hair was pulled back from her face. The few extra pounds she carried now. A soft buffer against the world he represented. He had always preferred her leaner, sharper, like a weapon he could wield. She saw the dismissal in his eyes, the faint curl of his lip. It should have hurt. Instead, a strange, cold calm settled over her. He thought her soft. He thought her weak. Good. Let him. Tiffany was now walking toward them, her stiletto heels clicking impatiently on the marble floor. Her presence was an intrusion, a garish splash of color in a somber portrait. Dante. Darling? Is everything all right? She asked, her voice high and saccharine. Dante did not look at her. Go back to the table, Tiffany, he ordered, his voice quiet but absolute. The command was not a request. The girl flushed, hesitating for a second before turning on her heel and retreating, her public humiliation a small, ugly spectacle. He had always been good at that, making a point without raising his voice. The silence he left in his wake was louder than any shout. Leah began to gather her things, folding her napkin and placing it on the table. The meal was over. The day was ruined. Isabella. We should go. Isabella looked from her son to Leah, her face a mask of conflict and pain. Yes, I think we should. Dante's hand shot out, not touching her, but landing flat on the table beside her purse. The gesture was a wall. Stay. It was the same tone he had used with the girl. Command.
Leah froze, her hand hovering over her back.
She looked at his hand. It was a beautiful hand, long-fingered and strong. A gold signet ring on his pinky finger, the one that had belonged to his father. She remembered the weight of that hand on her back, in her hair. She remembered it stained with blood that was not his own. We're leaving, Dante, she said, her voice even. She would not be commanded. Not anymore. She met his gaze, and for a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of the man she had married. A flash of regret, of loss. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold, hard mask of the dawn. I'm not asking, he said softly. The threat was not for her, she realized. It was for the room. It was for the man he had been scheduled to meet, a man who was likely watching this very interaction. Her presence here, with his mother, was a complication he had not anticipated. And Dante Moretti did not tolerate complications. Leah stood up slowly, her chair making a soft scraping sound. She refused to be a pawn in his games. It was lovely to see you, Dante. Enjoy your lunch. She kept her voice light, dismissive. She took Isabella's arm, and together they walked away from the table, away from him. She did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on her, a physical weight against her spine. She could feel the fury rolling off him in cold waves, the fury of a man whose command had been defied. They walked through the hushed restaurant, past the table where Tiffany sat pretending to study the menu, her face tight with anger. They did not stop until they were outside, the cool air of the city a welcome shock against Leah's heated skin. Isabella was trembling, leaning heavily on her. I am sorry, Leah. I am so sorry. Leah shook her head, hailing a cab. It's not your fault, Isabella. You have a right to see your son. The cab pulled up, and Leah opened the door, helping the older woman inside before sliding in beside her. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Isabella turned to her eyes filled with a desperate urgency. It is not what you think. He is in trouble, Leah. Real trouble. The kind he cannot handle alone. Leah looked out the window, at the city blurring past. She had heard those words before. Trouble was Dante's shadow. It followed him everywhere. That's not my life anymore, she said, her voice flat. She had escaped. She would not be pulled back in. But as she spoke the words, a cold dread settled in her stomach. She had defied him in public. In his world, such acts had consequences. She had not escaped anything. She had just painted a target on her back. Dante did not come for her. Not at first. A week passed. A week in which Leah tried to force the encounter from her mind, to bury it under the familiar dust and quiet of the archives. She lost herself in the delicate fibers of a 16th-century tapestry, in the meticulous cataloging of a new acquisition. She told herself the cold knot in her stomach was just anxiety. She told herself she was being paranoid. But she found herself checking the locks on her apartment door twice. She found herself scanning the faces in the subway car. The peace she had so carefully built was gone, replaced by a low, humming tension. He was out there, predator circling. She knew he would not let her defiance go unanswered. The only question was when and how he would strike. The when came on a Tuesday evening. She was working late, alone in the climate-controlled stillness of the deep storage archives. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the environmental systems. It was her sanctuary, a place of order and history, a world away from the chaos Dante inhabited. That is why the sound of the heavy steel door opening was such a violation. She looked up from the illuminated manuscript she was examining, her heart seizing in her chest. No one came down here without clearance. No one. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, blocking the light from the hallway. For a terrifying second, she thought it was one of his men. Then he stepped into the room, and the sterile fluorescent light fell across his face. It was Dante. He closed the door behind him, the heavy thud echoing in the silence. He was alone. He wore no suit, just dark trousers and a black cashmere sweater that made him look younger, more dangerous. "How did you get in here?" she asked, her voice sharp, betraying none of the fear that was a cold flood in her veins. He glanced around the room, at the rows of sterile metal shelves, the carefully labeled archival boxes. His expression was one of mild distaste, as if the quiet order of her world was an offense to him. "There are no doors I cannot open, Leah." You know that he walked toward her, his footsteps unnervingly silent on the concrete floor. He stopped on the other side of the large oak table where she worked, the priceless manuscript lying between them. He did not look at the book. He looked at her. "My mother is worried about me," he began, his voice devoid of emotion. "She believes I am in some kind of trouble." Leah said nothing. She waited. "She is correct," he continued. "A rival family, the Petrovs, they are making a move. They are not like the old families. They have no respect, no honor. They are butchers." He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers. "They were responsible for what happened to Marco." The name hung in the air between them. Marco, his cousin, the man who had been like a brother to him, the man who had died in a hail of bullets 2 years ago, in the car she had been in. The night that had ended her marriage. She felt the old trauma rise up, the memory of shattered glass and her own screaming. She pushed it down. "What does that have to do with me?" she asked, her voice tight. He gestured to the table, to the clutter of her work. Old maps, ledgers, photographs. The Petrovs are moving their product through old channels, old smuggling routes that have not been used in 50 years. They are hidden, but they leave traces. In city records, in property deeds, in old photographs. His gaze was intense. "You know how to find things that are lost. You know how to read the past." She finally understood. He was not here to punish her. He was here because he needed her. He needed her mind, her specific, unique skill. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. The very thing he had disdained, her quiet, academic world, was now the only thing that could help him. "No," she said. The word was quiet but firm. "Absolutely not. My life is my own now, Dante. I will not be a part of yours." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the small space. "This is not a request. The Petrovs saw you. At the restaurant. They saw you with my mother. They saw you defy me." A cold chill went down her spine. "They think you are a weakness. Pressure point. They will not come for me directly. They will come for you. Or they will come for my mother." He said it so calmly. A simple statement of fact. That was the master stroke. He had not come with threats of his own. He had come with the threat of his enemies. He was offering her protection, a cage she had just escaped. "I will not let them touch either of you," he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. "But to stop them, I need to know their routes. I need to know where they will be. You will help me." It was not a question. It was a declaration. She was already caught in his web. Her defiance in the restaurant had not been an act of freedom. It had been the move that trapped her completely. She looked at the man across the table. He was a killer, a monster draped in cashmere and cologne. He was also the only thing standing between her and men who were worse. And he was the only thing standing between them and Isabella. That was the part she could not ignore. She could weather a threat to herself. She had done it before. But she would not be the reason Isabella got hurt. "If I do this," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "it is for her, not for you." A flicker of something, maybe triumph, maybe something else, crossed his face. "I don't care why you do it," he said. "I only care that you do." He pushed a small, encrypted flash drive across the table. It slid over the polished oak and stopped just short of the ancient manuscript. A piece of the brutal present landing in the heart of the preserved past. "Everything we have is on there. Financial records, old photographs, maps. Find me something, Leah. Find me a ghost." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the silent room. The heavy door closed behind him, the lock clicking into place. She was alone, but she was no longer safe. She looked at the flash drive, then at her own hands. They were trembling. She had told herself she was out. She had lied. She was back in the center of his world, a world of violence and ghosts, and this time, she had walked in with her eyes wide open. He installed her in a place she had never been, a penthouse apartment in a nondescript tower in Midtown that he clearly used as a safe house. It was sterile, impersonal, decorated in shades of gray and black. There were no photographs, no books, nothing to suggest a life was lived there. It was a waiting room between acts of violence. Two of his men, silent and imposing, stood guard outside the door. She was a protected prisoner. For 3 days she worked. She sat at a large glass desk with 2 monitors, the flash drive a small, dark heart plugged into the laptop. She fell into the work, the familiar rhythm of research a small comfort in the terrifying new reality. She cross-referenced names from old financial ledgers with property deeds from the city archives, a system she could access remotely through the museum's server. She was breaking every rule of her profession, committing a dozen ethical and potentially illegal violations. She told herself it was necessary. Dante came and went. He would appear without warning, standing in the doorway watching her work. He rarely spoke. He would just watch, his presence a heavy weight in the room. He looked tired, the skin around his eyes darker than she remembered. The war with the Petrovs was taking its toll. On the 3rd night, she found something. It was a name, a shell corporation, that appeared in a 1950s shipping ledger and then again in a recent offshore banking transaction linked to the Petrovs. It was the thread. She followed it, diving deeper, her fingers flying across the keyboard. It led her to a series of warehouse properties along the Brooklyn waterfront, all purchased by the same corporation over the past 6 months. She was so focused, she did not hear him enter. "What is it?" His voice startled her. She jumped, her hand flying to her chest. He was standing right behind her, closer than he had been in 2 years. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell the faint scent of sandalwood. "I think I found them," she said, her voice breathless. She pointed to the screen, to the map of the waterfront dotted with red pins. These warehouses. They're all owned by a company called Atlantic Imports. The same name from a ledger in your family's 1950s records. He leaned over her, his arm brushing hers as he looked at the screen. Her skin tingled where he touched her. It was a simple, accidental contact, but it sent a jolt through her. She could feel the hard muscle of his forearm against hers. He was so close she could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the single small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He had gotten it the same night Marco died. Atlantic Imports, he murmured, his voice a low rumble in her ear. My grandfather's first company. He straightened up, his face grim. They are using our own history against us. He turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. You did good, Leah. It was not praise. It was a simple acknowledgement of fact. But coming from him, it felt like more. He left, and the apartment was silent again, but the space where he had stood still felt charged, electric. She touched her arm where he had brushed against it. She told herself it was just the shock of his proximity. It was just a memory, but it felt like a beginning. The next day, the attack came. Not against Dante. Against her. She was on a sanctioned trip to the museum, escorted by one of Dante's men, to retrieve a physical map she needed from the archives. They were walking back to the car when it happened. A black sedan screeched around the corner, two men leaning out the windows, guns raised. Dante's man, a stoic giant named Nico, shoved her behind him, drawing his own weapon. The street erupted in chaos. People screamed and scattered. The sound of gunfire was deafening, a brutal, percussive assault on the senses. Nico returned fire, his movements economical and precise. He was good, but he was outnumbered. Leah was pressed against the cold brick of the building, her mind screaming. This was it. This was the end. The memory of Marco's death came rushing back, the smell of cordite, the sight of blood. She was going to die here on a dirty sidewalk, because of a man she had tried to leave behind. Then, from the other end of the street, another car, a black SUV, roared toward them. Dante. He was driving, his face a mask of pure fury. He did not slow down. He aimed the heavy vehicle directly at the sedan, ramming into its side with a sickening crunch of metal. The gunfire stopped. Dante was out of the SUV before it even stopped moving, a gun in his hand, moving with a predatory grace that was terrifying to behold. The fight was over in seconds. It was not a fight. It was an execution. Swift, brutal, and silent. When it was over, he came to her. He holstered his weapon and reached for her, his hands checking her for injuries. His touch was rough, urgent. Are you hurt? He demanded, his voice raw. She shook her head, unable to speak. She was trembling, the adrenaline a painful surge in her veins. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in a crushing embrace. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel him shaking. Or maybe she was the one shaking. She did not know. He held her for a long moment, his body a solid, warm shield against the horror of what had just happened. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words muffled against her hair. Leah. I'm sorry. He was apologizing for what his enemies had done. But she knew he was apologizing for more. For everything. For pulling her back into this life. He let her go, his hands lingering on her arms. His eyes were dark with a rage so profound it seemed to suck the light from the air. This ends now, he said, his voice deadly quiet. He took her arm and led her to his SUV. The street now eerily silent except for the distant wail of sirens. He had not just saved her life. He had revealed a part of himself she had never seen. A raw, desperate fear of losing her that he could not hide. The wall between them had been breached. Back in the sterile silence of the penthouse, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a terrifying clarity. The attack had changed something. It had made the threat visceral, real. It was no longer an abstract problem on a screen. It was gunfire and shattered glass. It was the cold reality that her life was forfeit. Dante stood by the window, his back to her, staring out at the city lights. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with unspoken words. She had crossed a line today, not just by being a target but by what she had done before. Accessing the museum's servers, using her credentials to aid a criminal enterprise, his criminal enterprise. She had sacrificed her principles, the very foundation of the quiet life she had built. She had done it for Isabella, she told herself. But that was only part of the truth. She had also done it for him. "You should have let me go," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. He did not turn. "I couldn't." "Why?" she pressed, needing to hear it. "Why pull me back into this, Dante? You said you wanted to protect me. That's why you ended it. That's what you told me." He finally turned to face her. The anger was gone, replaced by a weariness that seemed to settle deep in his bones. "Protecting you meant pushing you away," he said, his voice rough. "I thought if you were gone, if you were separate from my life, they would leave you alone. I was wrong. My father used to say that once you are in this life, you are never truly out." The stain remains. He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. "When I saw you in that restaurant, happy with my mother, I hated you for it, because you had escaped, and I was still trapped." His honesty was a blow, more stunning than any lie. "And then I saw the way the Petrov's man at the bar looked at you, and I knew I had made a terrible mistake. Pushing you away didn't make you safe. It just made you unprotected." This was the confession. Not of love, but of a deeper, more dangerous truth. He could not live with her, and he could not live without her being safe. And the only way to ensure her safety was to pull her back into the heart of the danger, where he could control it, where he could be her shield. "You crossed a line for me today, Leah," he said, his gaze dropping to her hands. "At the museum. I know what that cost you." She did not deny it. They both knew. The silence was their shared admission. She had stepped into his world. He had just admitted he never truly left hers. But as she processed his words, a cold, terrible thought began to form. He was so certain it was the Petrovs. But the attack today felt wrong. It was too public, too sloppy for a rival family trying to be surgical. Felt like a message. But what if the message was not from an outsider? What if it was from someone on the inside? Someone trying to escalate the conflict, to force Dante's hand. The thought was chilling. The enemy he was fighting might not be the real enemy at all. The real threat could be someone standing right beside him. She voiced the thought, her words cutting through the tense quiet. The attack today. It was messy, public. Is that their style? The Petrovs? Dante frowned, his eyes narrowing. He had been so consumed by the fury and the relief of her survival that he had not analyzed the tactics. "No," he admitted slowly. "They're usually more precise, cleaner." "It felt like a performance," Leah said, the pieces clicking into place in her archivist's mind. "It was designed to look like them, to provoke you into an all-out war, to make you move on those warehouses before you were ready." Dante was silent, but she could see the gears turning behind his eyes. He was a master strategist, but his rage over the threat to her had blinded him. He had been played. "Who?" he asked, the single word a blade of ice. "Who would benefit from a war?" Leah thought back to the data, the names, the transactions. There was nothing obvious. The betrayal had to be deeper. "Someone you trust," she said. "Someone who knew I would be at the museum today. Someone who knew Nico would be my only guard." The circle of suspects was terrifyingly small. His underboss, his top capos, the men he called family. The air in the room grew cold. The threat was not a rival family from the outside. It was a serpent inside his own house. And she, with her quiet, academic mind, was the one who had seen it. Her value to him had just shifted. She was not just a tool to find his enemies. She was the only one he could trust to see the truth. The final confrontation was not a firefight. It was a dinner. Dante called a meeting of his top lieutenants at a private dining room in one of his restaurants in Little Italy. It was a summons no one could refuse. Leah was there. Not at the table, but in the small office adjoining the room, watching on a security monitor. It was her idea. The traitor would not expect her presence. He would not expect her to be the trap. Dante sat at the head of the table, a king holding court. His face was a mask of cold cordiality. He spoke of the war with the Petrovs, of the need for unity, for strength. Leah watched the men around the table. His underboss, Enzo, a man with faded tattoos and weary eyes. His capos, old and young, all of them projecting an aura of loyalty. But one of them was acting. As Dante spoke, he placed a folder on the table. "I have a new piece of information," he said, his voice level. "A new target. Our friend in the archives found something else on the monitor." Leah saw a subtle reaction. A flicker. It was Sal, Dante's youngest capo, the one he had been grooming, the one who was always at his side. A slight tensing of the shoulders. A glance toward the office door where she was hidden. He thought she was the target. Dante opened the folder. Inside was not a map or a target. It was a single photograph. A grainy security image from a bank in the Cayman Islands. It showed Sal meeting with a man whose face was unmistakable. Dmitry Petrov. "Sal," Dante said, his voice dangerously soft. "You have been busy." The room went absolutely still. Every man at the table froze, their eyes on the young capo. Sal's face went white. He started to stammer, to deny it, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew he was caught. "He promised me," Sal began, his voice cracking. "He promised me a seat at the table. My own territory." "There is no table," Dante said, his voice like the closing of a tomb. "There is only family. And you betrayed it." What happened next was swift and brutal. Dante did not move. He simply nodded at Enzo. The underboss and another man seized Sal, pulling him from his chair. There was no struggle. There was only the chilling, absolute finality of Dante's judgment. They dragged him from the room. A door closed. A single, muffled sound followed. And then silence. Dante sat at the head of the empty table, the photograph still in front of him. He had not moved. He had not flinched. He had surgically removed the cancer from his family. When he came into the office, he looked older. The cost of the betrayal was etched on his face. He looked at Leah, who stood by the monitor, her arms wrapped around herself. "It's over," he said. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She had helped him do this. She had set the trap that had led to a man's death. A line had been crossed that she could never uncross. He walked to her, stopping in front of her. He reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. His touch was no longer rough, but achingly tender. "You saved us, Leah," he said. "You saw what I could not. You saved my family." He was not just talking about his organization. He was talking about him and his mother. He was talking about her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, heavy key attached to a simple leather fob. He pressed it into her hand, closing her fingers around it. "This is for my home," he said. "Not the apartment. My home. The one in Westchester. No one has this key. Not Enzo. Not my mother. Only me." He looked into her eyes, and she saw everything he could not say. It was not a declaration of love. It was a declaration of trust. The most valuable currency in his world. An oath. "You are not a prisoner anymore," he said. "You can go anywhere you want, but you will always have a safe place to return. If you want it." The next day, she was back in her own apartment. The quiet felt different now. It was not the peace of solitude. It was the silence of a choice waiting to be made. His men were gone. The threat was gone. She was, for the first time, truly free. On her small kitchen table, next to a vase of white hydrangeas, sat the key. It was heavy in her palm, the metal cool against her skin. It was the key to a world she had fought to escape, a world of violence and fear. It was also the key to the only man who had ever truly seen her, the man who had torn her life apart and then, in his own brutal way, put it back together. It was a key to a home. She looked at it, the brass catching the afternoon light. She did not pick it up. She did not put it away. She simply stood there, in the quiet of her apartment, and looked at the choice laid out before her. The door to his world was closed. But now she held the only key, and she was the only one who could decide whether or not to open it.